Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. I'm Christoph van Tomme, and together with my co-host Mark Burgauer and our guests, we explore how deliberate complexity, social practice theory, and a deeper understanding of socio-technical systems can transform our organizations and the world we live in.
Hi, I'm Mark Burgauer. Welcome to the next episode in the Deliberate Complexity series. We continue with our conversation with Jabe Bloom. Jabe currently works as a Senior Director in the Global Transformation Office at RedHat. Jabe has been transforming and researching the organizational dynamics and interactions of management, design, development, and operational excellence for over 20 years as an executive, academic, and consultant. Jabe is also in the final stages of writing his PhD dissertation at Carnegie Mellon in transition design. We have split this interview into two episodes. In the first part, we talked about how building software within an enterprise is a philosophical argument and how knowing some philosophy can help. What is a pharmacon? And what is the Goldilocks space of complexity? Technical debt as an example of how deterministic systems can have agency within a socio-technical system, and the origin story of Jabe's model of the three economies, how this helps budgeting complexity, and how that is key for successfully building platforms. This week, we'll talk about how organizational design is still stuck in organizational engineering, how to get beyond that, and how we have to rethink our understanding of roles. Jabe explains Alicia Juarrero's term of neurological recursion using high school cliques. How do complex systems stabilize towards hetearchies of mediated interactions between coexisting hierarchies within the organization? And finally, how this all informs creating APIs that enable the emergence of higher level constructs.
Are there other places where you would want to invest complexity? And I'm interested in, so one of my hypotheses is that humans need complexity to have like a human experience. And that means that you have to be able to invest some of your complexity budget in your teams.
Sure. Yep.
How do you navigate that? And have you ever needed to navigate this?
Yeah, so here's the things that I would start to talk about that, like navigating. The first thing, and I talk about this at two different levels often, I talk about this as like there's two problems inside of organizations when we talk about organizational design, right? And let's just start by saying that I use a term called designerly, and designerly means like the way that a designer would think about something as opposed to the way that like an engineer might think about something. And I think they're different, the way that designers think and the way that engineers think. And to that extent, organization design is not designerly. It is organizational engineering. But most people who've been engaged in any sort of organization design have been engaged in organization engineering. It's a rational process for assigning responsibilities through, org charts and RASKIs and all sorts of stuff that are intended to do what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation: reduce uncertainty. Who's responsible for what? Who do I talk to? Who do I, what's the single throat to choke nonsense and stuff like that, right? So it tries to make your organization deterministic. So organization design, then, I think, is this thing that's relatively unexplored, and we should explore it more, right? We should understand it, and it should be informed by complexity. So the first thing I would say is that at two different levels, we have problems. One is role-based descriptions. So everybody gets a role, what you should do. Terribly uncomplexity defined. Like, who cares? Like, in complexity, we don't talk about like define all the parts and then like stick the parts together and you get something. No, that's not what we talk about, right? What we talk about is the interaction between the parts. So first thing you might want to do if you're going to do complexity informed organization design would be literally that role descriptions should have a significant description of what roles they interact with and what those interactions are like. Like, who does a software architect talk to? What do they talk about? How often do they meet? What are they, what are the interactions between the different roles, right? And so I think that's really important. I would tend to also have this other argument around roles, just to start with. So we'll do teams in a second, but roles, which is that roles themselves can be inherently destructive or not useful because they have a residue or a like memory of saying, okay, the architect is the person who architects. I have a problem with this, and at Red Hat we call, or inside the GTO at Red Hat we call this the 5 elements. And so what we say is that to run an organization that's creating software, you need a development capability, not role, capability, a operational capability, an architecture capability, a product management capability, and a leadership capability. Those are the 5 elements that you need, or 5 capabilities that you need inside of an organization. And so that means, let's take architecture for instance. Architecture isn't done by architects. Architecture is a capability that a firm either has or does not have. And it's done by everybody in the organization, right? Because product owners either are working in alignment with an architecture or not. Developers are either implementing the architecture or not. Operations people are either influencing the architecture to become more operable or not. All of these capabilities are interacting with architecture. So again, you get this idea, I think, that there is a system of capabilities interacting with each other, and that is what you would want to understand if you were doing organizational design. You'd want to understand what the capabilities are, how they interact. And I have like all these crazy spiderweb versions of that where I talk about the interactions, which might be fun to talk about at some point. So I think if you want to stick with roles, the first thing to do is you describe roles as in their interactions. Sometimes you'll hear, like David Snowden would call this crew theory, like how do the roles interact with each other? Crew theory is like, I think, more important in the military because like you need certain tasks to be performed, and if the person that performs that task is killed, then someone needs to be able to step in and do those tasks. And so that there's more strict role-based kind of assignments in military theory, I think. In organizational theory, I think you could probably skip the roles and talk about capabilities and your responsibilities as an individual to perform certain capabilities. So that's one thing. The second thing is teams. I really dislike the common term de-siloing. I think it's not my favorite thing ever. Because I think that operators do different things than developers do. And I don't think it's great to think that you're going to turn your developers into operators. I don't think it's great to think you're going to turn your operators into developers. I do think it's good that operators understand how to develop things for operations, but that's a whole different discussion. They should be more like developers doing operations. But anyway, sometimes I say to people like, to understand that a little bit better, DevOps isn't about consolidating development and operations. It's about developers becoming better developers by understanding the code in operation. And it's about operators becoming better operators by understanding how code is developed. That's what DevOps is. It's not about smashing it into like a homogeneous blob. As a result, then what I think is important when you're doing organizational design is to less worry about what happens inside of the individual teams, although, probably having some description of their responsibilities is fine, but actually spend a significant amount of time literally talking about how they interact. And so like one of the things that I'm always surprised about, and I did a bunch of work with Kat Switell around this. We used to call them cat naps, which not a cat nap, but a cat nap. She's very clever like that with her terminology. Anyway, and the idea was this, and I've seen this a bunch of places, the problem, which is someone rolls in with like an org change, they change the teams and stuff like that. You're assigned to a new team. Someone explains what your team is supposed to do. They never explain what any of the other teams are doing. They never explain to you like what work how the work you're doing will like go to them. Who's going to talk to who on which team? None of that stuff ever occurs, right? So to me, part of like an organizational transformation should be every team should say, what teams do I interact with? And then they should all get in the room and say, how does our interaction work? Like, what work do I hand to you? What work do you hand to me? Who talks to who? What are the topics? How often do we meet? Like, how do we interact with each other? And again, because that to me is more complexity informed, because it's about interaction. It's not about the parts. It's about how the parts work together. And that conversation is just like absolutely missing from almost all organizational transformations that I've ever been involved in. People just, they want to reorganize into different teams, and then they never want to have those other discussions. And I think that's the highest kind of value conversations you can have at the team structure level. Yeah. So does that help at all?
No, it's I think it's really good to talk about like the interconnections and how it's all about the interconnections and putting a focus on that for people that are listening. That's super important, I think. I think what I'm personally, so I need to tell a little bit more about our business to explain it. So we started as a Drupal consultancy long, 16 years ago. And along the way, we've tried to be self-organizing and non-hierarchical. We've bumped into issues with that, like the tyranny of the structureless is something that we're very on first speaker terms with. And what I'm trying to figure out is, at the same time, for me, doing business is about creating work experiences, is making sure that the people that I work with are not going to hate their jobs. Yeah. And that's like a really important part of doing business, because I'm part of a system in which those people are also parts. So if I make their life miserable, guess what? My life will also be miserable, because we're sharing a system. And so making sure that the experience is good is important, but at the same time, there's a trade-off happening, because if you don't put any constraints, then you get the structureless thing, and then also, guess what? Nobody's happy again because you overspent your complexity budget. Yep. How do you navigate this? So where, I don't know if this is for this podcast, maybe this is for a follow-up episode where we go maybe deeper into the social aspect of systems. But this is like a big question that I'm chewing on, because I've gotten to that we do need some form of hierarchy to hire. Not all hierarchy is bad. Hierarchy is actually good, or can be good. But there's a different way of doing hierarchy that respects the autonomy and the dignity of the people that are part of the system. And then figuring out how do you spend, or how do you give some complexity budgets to the team so that they can have their dignity and autonomy respected.
So there's a couple things so usually when I try to talk about like complexity inside of social organizational structures, there's a couple things that I talk about. One is, I think like it's important to understand, do you guys have an idea of a clique? You know what I mean when I say clique? Have you ever seen Mean Girls, the movie Mean Girls?
I haven't seen it.
So it's like this, in high school, did you have like groups of people who
clique together? Yeah, become a clique? Got it. Yeah, clique. Yeah.
The weird thing about a clique is that it's like a bunch of random people, and then all of a sudden they're together, and then all of a sudden there's rules about who's in the clique or who's not, but like there's usually almost never like an official leader who's like in charge of the rules. The rules just kind of emerge. And part of the reason they emerge is to create the structure that is the clique, right? Yeah. They create a way of knowing who's in the clique and who's out of the clique and all that kind of stuff, right? So like, this is an example of what Alicia calls neurological recursion. So neurology is just the study of parts and wholes, and recursion is the idea that there's a loop. And what she's talking about when she talks about this is a loop that goes between the hierarchy, and it's the difference between bottom up and top down, right? And so lots and lots of organizations, especially organizations that try to do agility or, open space or, holacracy or all these things, are very concerned about bottom up stuff. But the argument that Alicia, I think, might make, or at least I think she makes in her book, is that bottom up does not create a new phase space, because it doesn't create closure in the system. So closure only happens when you get bottom up as the start, and then there's some sort of test against the environment that says, does this configuration, this relatively random configuration of, people or components or whatever, does this work in the environment? And if it does, then there becomes a top-down pressure to keep that unit organized. And that's the top-down aspect of it, right? So the hierarchical recursion is the idea that there's bottom-up pressures and then there's top-down pressures that keep the system together, and that they happen in that kind of interleaved manner, right? And I think the interesting to notice, for me at least, the way that I think about this is that the initial test ends up being against an environmental force. So you configure something like a team, you put a team together, and you see if they can operate together. That's the test against the environment. And then when it does, they start making rules, right, about how we work and agreements, and they build tools, and that causes cohesion to occur that keeps the team together, right? Those stabilizing forces that happen in there are not from the environment. They're from the team causing a loop to recurse that keeps them stabilized. So if the environment changes, one of the problems that you get is that some of these rules may no longer be valid in this new environment. They may keep the team together, but they may be counter effective to the actual environment that the team is addressing. So there's some problems there that you have to kind of pay attention to. And so for that reason, one of the things I like to talk to people about, or try to convince people about, is that you don't want to have, you should consider the difference between hierarchy and hetearchy. Hetearchy is context-specific hierarchy. And if you embrace hetearchy, in other words, that we can organize our system into a hierarchy that's specifically aligned to a particular context, then one of the skills that you want to learn is how to quickly build and take down hierarchies. In other words, you want to understand how to create a hierarchy to respond to an event or a market opportunity, and then you want to understand how to take it back apart so that you can build another one based on the next context that you enter. So the trick should be is to avoid the dogma of hierarchy is bad, but understand that hierarchy should be temporal. It shouldn't be permanent. And that what you want is to be able to build temporary hierarchies that are responsive to market needs, not long-standing hierarchies that are not like this. And I will tell you that, that's roughly me arguing against long-standing teams, which is another agile dogma in my mind. And I think it's important to understand that some of those dogmas get overplayed and people are dogmatic about them, and that's harmful to their organizations. So that's one of the things I would think about is think about not just the individual agency that you want the organization to have, but the organizational capability, the ability to organize yourselves as something that is missing in so many organizations. So many organizations can only be organized by a complete top-down hierarchical command and control. The organization of the system is done that way. And that's almost certainly, and plenty of people will talk about I'm going to have this top-down organizational structure that I've imposed, but I'm going to decentralize decision-making. It's nonsense. It's because you think your organization is some sort of information processing system, and it's not. It's a social system that has to occasionally think about information, but that's not what it's there for. Anyway, so random rant.
I want to quickly challenge you that so first of all, I agree that there should be no dogmas about long-standing teams, but there's equally an understanding that a lot of the issues that teams are solving have long histories, as in they are needed in a long time. So I think there's a middle ground about hetearchies, about, yes, you should always be aware that you might have to dismantle a hierarchy, but another way to think about hetearchies is also that different hierarchies compete or coexist within a system, and at different times they have different weights in influence how they mediate the system as a whole.
Yep.
So in nature we have seasons, and so different parts of an organism will have stronger influence over the organism's behavior depending on the season.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I think we should think equally about organizations in this way. So when does a certain hierarchy needs to have stronger influence, and when does it need to tone it back? So hierarchy theory, for example, understands hierarchy just as facilitation of energy flows.
Yep.
And then, so if we translate energy flows into value flows for organizations, then there are different times in the organizational's whole life cycle where different values need to be favored over other values.
100%. Yep.
Is there maybe some form of like anti-fragile architecting of heterarchies, where, because this is how cells do it, right? They're a gene is translated into messenger RNA. That's has a very short lifetime. It gets transported, it gets transcribed a couple of times, gets broken down, and then you have to like start all over again. Is there something similar that you imagine that we need?
So this is actually my father was a hand surgeon and orthopedist, and it's actually a talk that I've also, or a concept I've also seen talked about in resilience engineering communities. Dr. Wood talks about it occasionally. And it's my primary objection, it's my primary example, objection to absolute anti-fragile, right? Like the idea that systems only gain strength, right? So when you look at bones, and bones have osteoblast, osteopast, there's one more I can't remember, but there's 3 different cells that build your bones or tear them down. And the interesting one to me is the tear down one, right? So like when you train for a marathon, which I ran foolishly more than once, but anyway, some significant amount of the training is beating your bones against pavement. And the reason for that is because if you go out and try to run more than 15 miles, you might have the cardiovascular capability to do that, but you can give yourself really bad shin splints. You can fracture your bones. And so what you have to do is you have to go out and run, an increasing amount of time. And often, honestly, like in the early phases of training, they'll say like, run 18 miles, but it doesn't matter how fast you do it. I don't care. You have to run 18 miles. Like you can stop, you can do whatever you want. You just have to run 18 miles today. And the reason is because when you hit your bones, your legs against the ground, it activates your bones to create more bone structure. And these little cells show up and they start building more bone. And your legs get stronger and your bones get stronger, you're less likely to have a fracture. But the trick is that there's costs involved in having higher bone density. And your body eventually, if you don't keep doing that, these other cells will show up and they will start tearing the bone down, which is part of what I'm talking about, right? Is that when a lot of anti-fragile only hears the like building bone density by having a positive reaction to a negative effect, right? Like hitting the pavement is bad and you're anti-fragile because you build strength based on that negative interaction, right? That's the anti-fragile. But in natural systems, it's not good to be strong all the time. Often what you want to do is tear the strength down to reinvest the calcium in other things or to lighten your bone structure so you can do other things. And that's the part that I think that we get in hierarchies that's bad, which is, the calcification, the way in which the system over-strengthens certain parts of the system that should only be temporary. I talk about, like, sometimes when I talk about kind of temporal design, one of the things I talk about is like, you should decide, or not decide, but you should be aware of a certain type of design parameter that you have, which is how long do I want this thing to exist? Is this like something that should be like, ephemeral. It's like a flash mob or a swarm to solve something. Or is this like a temporary team? Or is this like a team that's going to last for 2 years? And then be careful not to build so much structure that whatever timeline you think the team should have, it outlives that, right? It becomes a self-perpetuating system. I talk a lot about that as being like, in organizations, you end up with zombie policies and zombie teams. People do things they literally don't know the purpose of because, we needed it long ago, but the context is no longer appropriate, that type of stuff. You get the same thing with teams and organizational structures and hierarchies, I think. And worse, in lots of organizations, I don't know in Europe, but in the United States, people are compensated based on how many people report to them. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they ossify the systems under them to make sure that they maintain their VP title and their salary. So they don't want you to have temporary systems underneath them. So anyway, yeah, that's one of the things I might say is like, I think that, being responsive to the environment is good. And being responsive in kind of an anti-fragile, self-perpetuating way is fine. But you should never overbuild something that you can't take back apart again and have a thought about how to take it apart, I think. So that's what I would think about a little bit.
I have another one, Mark, unless you want to go. I want to go back a little bit because there was something you were talking about, like the Amazon example. And I hear, and I want to check this. It sparked an idea. I hear a lot of companies when I go talk about developer portals, like. They're talking about that's what we do in our business. They're talking about like, we want to implement this API first strategy, and we're going to have this marketplace where all these APIs are going to be. And then it feels to me that they're trying to replicate the Amazon model rather than really doing a platform.
Yep.
Does that mean that API first per se might be a side track, or there still is value in API first as like a first step towards a more coherent API platform?
So I talk about it. The first thing I usually talk about is like when I was talking about the cycle times and isolating things. So platform is an interface, right? So APIs are part of that strategy to me, like that it's important to have these interfaces, right? And I mean literally interface like the way that we talk about it in object orientation. You need to make sure that you don't have tightly bound internals. You need to have that abstraction there, and those APIs and the management of APIs and things like that, I think are really critical for that. But that to me, like in my mind, is like a super thin line that's often brittle, right? Like it's thin and it's brittle. It's like it's a contract-based system, right? And so a lot of people these days talk about like they talk about project to product as like a movement in the industry. Like we're going to get away from project-based things. We're going to move to product-based teams. There's some implications behind that. They're longer lasting and blah blah blah. Right? I think the other significant movement that we're seeing is from service to platform. So service to me is close to API in that it is contractually based, is thin. It has to do with, it doesn't have to do with teams interacting. It has to do with the exchange of something like information or objects or things like that. So to me, the second step, right, of a platform is to move beyond an API and move towards, I'm almost literally imagining as a fat space, like there's something there that's beyond the razor thin line. And the thing in there is the commons. It's the thing that we learn to negotiate. So in other words, it might be more like I have an API, but I also have a way for teams consuming the API to submit patches, to talk to me about how the infrastructure works, or how the application works, or how the object model works, or that there's some way to get behind the API and work in the platform as well, right? And so like the way that I generally kind of see this evolve inside organizations is I say like there's a shift between pushing tickets to pushing patches. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see as becoming a platform. There's a team then that is responsible for consuming those patches. And, so, one of the ways I try to talk about this to some extent is that like, and it's hard to talk about because people really quickly get distracted by the terminology, but methodologies that were used in open source projects for maintaining code, those methods are being reconsidered or reimagined in that it's not just now maintaining code, it's maintaining a platform which is sometimes I try to say it's like it's code in action. Like it's not just that I want your repos open to me. Mm-hmm. That's not a platform, right? It's that I want the operating platform open to me in a way that I can submit something and it will be in operation now, not just in a code repository, right? It's not just the sharing of code, because in theory, like I should be only consuming through the API. Therefore, the things that I should have access to from that perspective should be quite limited. But I should be able to then like peek around the corner and submit things to improve the API or to add things. That's the thing that ends up being in operation. And then I try to talk a little bit about this idea that, I think done well, there's like a harvesting process involved in this that has something that I mental elaboration. And so the way this works is like, when you first start coding something, like you're not sure if anybody's like, you've never tested it. Nobody's seen it in the world. Like, so if you created like absolutely perfect idiomatic code with complete unit testing and like just went through your entire production process to make sure it's bulletproof production code, and then you showed it to the first customer and was like, do you like it? And they were like, hell no, this is awful. You just wasted a huge amount of effort, right? So incremental elaboration would be, you should create something without a lot of unit testing, without going through your complete production process, and you should put it on some sort of little isolated server over here, and you should show it to somebody and say, do you like this? And then you should, once you get traction, then you could say, okay, so there's a difference in the quality of the code between MVP or a prototype and production. So we got now we need to make it production-ready code. Production-ready code at the application level has a certain level of qualities. We need to be able to do this and that. It needs to be operable on certain levels. We need, to have visibility and, observability stuff built into it, blah, 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 right? Great. Okay, so we deploy it. But now, with this harvesting theory of the way this might work, is that the platform team would go, okay, so other people are interested in the thing you just put into your application. But there's another level of quality that is involved in taking that and making it platform ready, because of platform ready, we might need multi-tenancy, we might need whatever, like there's other aspects of the code that need to get enriched. So to me, as you promote up these levels with these different parts of the code base and you submit patches, you shouldn't be building something that's not being actively worked in a marketplace, like a differentiation team. You should only graduate into a platform, so you avoid kind of build it and they will come type methodologies. But you have a platform team that's basically there to receive that harvested code and create that next level of quality that is platform level quality and deploy it. And that ends up being like the way that you get this kind of fluid movement to create something more than simply an API, but a platform. And sometimes I try to say it is like there's a difference between a platform and platforming. And the challenge at many organizations is that they don't know how to platform, they don't know how to do that activity. And to me, again, trying to be polite to my host, but like to me, stopping at an API has the challenge or the potential of preventing the organization from going to that next level, which is learning to collaborate across teams on a commons. Yeah.
Is this what I'm hearing is that, so I've also been involved in the inner source community where they are trying to take the principles from open source and take them into enterprise. But it sounds like there's some additional interactions that are necessary on top of inner source.
That's right. Yep.
And is this described somewhere? Is anybody like creating a platforming handbook or something like that? There's a couple groups that talk about platforming, but they become pretty abstract pretty quickly. And honestly, like inner sourcing would be part of what is the input to this, but it's also like something about team interaction and the socio-technical architecture bits that I try to talk through, things like that. So I should write more about it is the answer, because I know that other people, when I talk to them, recognize it as being important. And I know when I work with people, it's what I do with them, but I'm not sure how many people are writing down the lessons yet. I think, again, most organizations would have a massive advantage from, moving from not having any sort of API to moving towards API management. It's something, that absolutely organizations need to do. The question is like, so like I say this sometimes to people, like when I started Praxis Flow with Kevin Bear, we were quickly known as being like a DevOps-y place, like we did DevOps things, but we always used to tell people, well, the only reason we're doing this is to research what happens after DevOps. And the reason why we advertise that we're DevOps people is because we want to find clients who have done a lot of DevOps and aren't asking us the basic questions. They want to know what to do after DevOps. And I think the same thing is true about this platforming stuff. With the advent of Kubernetes and the way that Kubernetes is rolling out and the nature of cloud-based, again, infrastructure as a service aspects, these are the questions that the largest organizations are having to struggle with right now. Like, okay, like I now just can buy lots of primitives. Is that a good thing? Well, yes and no. Like, how are you using them? Okay, I have a service catalog. Do I just like get rid of the ticketing system and make everything available via API? Is that the right thing to do? Well, kind of, how do people get access to these things? If you lower the barrier to entry to primitives, you can cause really bad economic outcomes. And this happens all the time. People all the time go to AWS and other places, give their developers access to it without approval, and then they get a huge bill and like, where did all the money go? So how does that stuff work and things like that? So I think that's some of the questioning that people are trying to explore right now is like, we've got the components that we can configure in these different ways. How do we know how to configure them better? How do we get the advantage out of them? So one of the stories I've been telling to people that are doing API programs is that a developer portal is an interface for your interfaces.
Yep.
And that it allows you to, and this is something that I've seen people that are trying to build a context-free way of consuming APIs are saying like, no, that's not important. It's enough. Like it's this idea that's just a flat catalog is going to be enough. And I intuitively, I am very strongly feeling about this because, well, first it's our business, but also I can't believe it. Like there's something missing, but it's really hard to express like what is that context or what is it that you do when you take this bunch of APIs and like creates that interdependence of these individual interfaces that is going to turn it from API soup into an API platform.
Yeah. So, again, to me, part of the answer ends up being these patterns of hierarchy inside of the platform. So, I've been using the term primitives, but basically when I talk about a pattern, part of what I mean is these are the ways that you should use the CPU pool, the mem cache, the database, and it's all pre-configured so that you have access in the catalog. You might have access to all the primitives, but additionally you have access to like high memory utilization app template. Click. All pre-configured. Now I'm just working on my memcache based high memory utilization thing. Everything else is already pre-configured because we found natural ways to do that, and we don't want you to reinvent it, right? Same thing with the APIs. Like, it's great to have the APIs all there, but it's even better, to my mind, to have a bunch of pre-configured interactions between the APIs that give you access to a higher level construct, right? And that's, when we talk about this neurological recursion, one of the things we would talk about is the idea that when you get that closure that I talked about, like, again, the bottom up would be bunches of different APIs. Someone configures the API's interactions in a certain way that causes a top-down interaction that says, this is a stable system. This is a stable way that these APIs interact. Well, that, in theory, opens a phase space. In other words, this thing can now be used in other configurations at a higher level. It can become the part of another set of configurations at a higher level, right? And so, to me, a platform has some of that happening in it, that applications of primitives, there's different ways that I see it happening and unfolding in organizations. So one of the things might be like, your application has pre-configured ways of doing observability. Like the tools are automatically built in. You don't have to think about them as much. You have to just tweak them. They're already available. Another thing you get a lot in organizations is automated governance and compliance issues, so that the CI/CD pipeline doesn't ask you to perform the steps manually. It builds them into the CI/CD pipeline so that your governance or your security constraints reject a build the same way that your unit tests reject a build. And that's to build those services at the platform level into the interactions in a way that the developer doesn't have to go out and find them themselves, right? So that's all that, like, lowering the barrier to entry. Like, the really stupid way of saying this, that I shouldn't say stupid because this is the thing that my boss says all the time. Andrew says this all the time. The goal of a good platform is to make doing the right thing the simplest thing to do. And so the question is, like, what do you want people to do? Yeah. And then try to make the platform provide that as low cost to the developer as possible. The anti-pattern for that, by the way, that I see all sorts of organizations is they go in and they say, oh, so like what we want to do is give the developers self-service access to like whatever, CPU pool or the machine over there. Okay, that's great. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all the forms that like the project manager used to have to fill out and all the nonsense and bureaucracy that the project manager did, and we're going to expose all that nonsense directly to the developer. And the developers are like, I hate this. This is awful, right? Instead of figuring out how to eliminate that bureaucracy and slim it down and make it easier to consume the thing. So I don't know. That's the type of thing I think about, I guess, when I think that makes sense at all.
I'd love to talk more. There's a lot more here.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'd love to explore more about like how to bootstrap platforms and what are the patterns that you're already seeing being useful. Yep. Maybe also connecting it with inner sourcing. Totally. There's lots of stuff. I don't know, Mark. Yeah, Mark, do you have any last question or?
No. So all my questions would be biggerish. So I don't want to start them now. So the question is, are we doing a follow-up?
Yeah, I'd love to come back, and I especially would really like to talk about the platform stuff. Mm-hmm. That'd be great, for sure.
That's it for our interview with Jabe Bloom. If you want to learn more about Jabe's thinking, I recommend that you search for his name on YouTube, Vimeo, and any other video streaming platform. This podcast was brought to you by Pronovix and Contextualize. You can learn more about our companies at pronovix.com and maturitymapping.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, please mind your context.